from the shores of beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the heart of North Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discuss their topics on our forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum. With your host and moderator, political scientist, Tony Stewart.
We're most pleased to welcome you to today's program, and we're equally pleased to have as our guest Frank Henderson. As to background, he has a wealth of experience in government. He is the former mayor of Post Falls, Idaho. He's a former county commissioner and chair of the board of county commissioners in Kootenai County. And since his retirement from those positions, and actually it's not a retirement, he's taken on other endeavors that are extremely significant. Our guest represents the International Executive Service Corps on trips abroad. In fact, he has had 13 assignments from that organization, which is headquartered in Connecticut, around the world, in which he goes and is an advisor to governments as they're developing certain programs. He particularly spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union. In addition to those assignments, he's been abroad 16 times, so we're very fortunate to have this expert with us. And our guest is here today to deal with his most recent assignment, which was in Panama. Frank, my friend, it's great to have you back. You're always so generous to come here and do this program upon your return, and we're very eager to talk to you about your most recent assignment in Panama. Thank you for being here.
Well, I'm always pleased to be here, but you always sort of put me on alert when you say I'm an expert, because frankly, I come away realizing how little I really did know before I went and how much more I have to learn after I've gotten back.
You're always modest, because you wouldn't be assigned over and over if you weren't so helpful and beneficial. And thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to have our regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Vice President of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And before I turn it over to the panel, I want to take this opportunity, Frank, to show a wonderful poster that you brought here. And if you will take just a moment to, as they put this up on the screen, to tell us a little bit about what this is and what it does show about Panama.
That's a picture of the Milleflores Locks, which is at the Pacific end of the canal. In the background, in the far horizon, is a central part of Panama, the large lake, and way at the horizon would be the Atlantic Ocean. About 37 ships a day go through those locks.
Thank you very much. We appreciate having that as starting out. And with that, we'll turn the program over to Janelle Burke.
Well, Mr. Henderson, I concur with Tony. It's a pleasure to have you here again. I'm anxious to hear more about the Panama Canal, but most of us know of the canal, and we think of it in terms of ships going through it. But there's been some very active recent history with regard to the canal. So can you fill us in a little bit on what's going on there?
Well, the recent history starts with the treaty that was signed, I believe, enacted in 77 and maybe signed in 79. It's a treaty in which we turned the canal over to the Republic of Panama. So they will solely be the managers and administrators of that entire facility. It is, you have to see it to find out how huge it is, how complex the assignment is that they have. And frankly, I came away with a huge admiration for the people that I worked with who were in the administration. These are Panamanians, they're in the administration of that canal. These are educated people, highly educated, very knowledgeable, very practical people, and committed to doing a good job.
When will they actually assume control of the canal?
The official transfer will take place at noon on December 31st of this year.
So it's going to be right there with Y2K. But you also indicated that Panama is not just a dusty little country, but a very sophisticated country as well.
My wife and I were very surprised when we first went to Panama a year ago. Found Panama City to be a modern city. I believe there's 129 banks there. It's an international banking center. I think that's attracted by all the commerce that the maritime commerce that's done there, and also because their corporate tax structure is very low, and many foreign industries will do their official banking and have their corporate headquarters in Panama.
Steve Schenck.
Well, Frank, welcome back, first of all. 13 trips with the International Executive Service Corps. I'm pretty sure that's not a record, but it's a lot, and it does speak highly of your abilities. Could you tell the audience just a little bit about what IESC is and does?
Well, IESC, the International Executive Service Corps, is a nonprofit corporation located in Connecticut, started in 1964. And it was started by industrial people at that time who saw that in Africa and that part of the world we had some emerging nations which had to establish a viable local economy of their own. And they also saw that within the United States there were people like myself and you and Tony and people. We retire, but we've got a lifetime of experience and knowledge, education that they saw could be put to work in those developing countries. So they started this program where they make a match between your experience and somebody or some industry or some school in some foreign land that needs that technical input. They put you together and you train them in the technology that you have to offer. And that's been the role, is to train. It's not to go and do the work for them, but it's to train them so that they can sustain the effort after you've left.
Now, and I have some experience. I don't know whether to thank Frank or blame him for introducing my wife to the program. She's only made a couple of trips, but she's enjoyed them very much and felt that she was able to do something productive on both. Funding for IESC comes largely from where?
It comes largely from the United States government.
Grants?
There are grants made through the U.S. Agency for International Development, U.S. Information Agency, the U.S. Department of Defense, and then there are others like the World Bank and some European banks, some foundations, and there are a lot of corporate gifts, and there are, frankly, a lot of private gifts to support this operation.
Yeah, they do have a fundraising arm, and I'm familiar with that. My wife's work has been mostly with private businesses, and Frank and I have discussed this organization over dinner. But one question I've never asked you or her, I do know that her clients, she works with private businesses, I said, they do pay a part of the cost of bringing her over to work with them. What happens in the case of the governments that you work with? Do they also pick up a part of your expenses?
Sometimes, yes, they do. Sometimes they, instead of it being in a form of cash, they do it by providing the translator that's needed, full-time translation service, full-time driver, which can transport you to wherever you have to go to do your assignment. And most often and almost always they furnish the housing. Very often, especially in Eastern Europe, government owns all those concrete apartment buildings. And so they have vacancies, and that's where you live while you're on assignment.
And finally, if I may, Tony, I've got to believe that there are people out in the audience who are wondering how they might get involved in this program.
It's very easy. Just dial a 800 number. It's 1-800-243-4372, and just say you want to become a volunteer, and they'd be glad to take. And they need everybody. They need nurses, they need educators, bankers. Just every skill is needed.
Thank you.
Frank, let's talk about your particular assignment that you'd had very recently in Panama. I believe this is your second trip to Panama. This one was in assignment, but you and your wife had gone on an earlier trip. Tell us what the assignment was this time. What our viewers may not know from your previous trips here, if they had not viewed that, is that sometimes you go with a team. There's 2 or 3 of you. I know you've gone when you've had an economist with you. You've had someone in the political science arena, and you're certainly a local government expert. What happened on this trip? What did they want you to do in relation to your time in Panama?
Okay, first of all, there were 2 of us a year ago when we started this project. My trip a month ago was a follow-up.
Okay.
The second person a year ago is a man who previously had been city manager of some very large cities, including Long Beach, California. He's a past president of the International City Managers Association. Frankly, he's a real powerhouse. He's a heavyweight city administrator. And the 2 of us, I think, made a fairly effective team. And our assignment was really interesting. It's in Panama. Their entire economy revolves around the Panama Canal.
Right.
And the tolls, the revenue that generates of the ships that go through there. They wish to increase the traffic from 37 ships a day to 44, 45. The tolls are significant that they collect. And one of the problems in expanding that is the amount of water that's available to let these ships go from one end to the other. Each vessel requires 52 million gallons of water as it transits the canal. It needs that. And that water just flows from a centrally located lake out a gate and into the ocean, so the 52 million gallons is gone, has to be replaced in the watershed. That's where our assignment was located. Is that within the watershed, which is a basin that collects all the rainwater from the rain jungles, has been deteriorating just through sedimentation. They've lost 15% of the total capacity of that lake, and they can't afford to lose that if they're going to expand. And so they have to, and they had never instituted environmental laws or regulations, or if they did, they were never enforced routinely. And so there's been uncontrolled agriculture, uncontrolled timber harvesting, and uncontrolled construction taking place within the canal, which sometimes was harmful. So the government had given authority to several institutions within their government to work within the canal to preserve the environment, but it wasn't organized. This group did this, and this group did this, and this group did this, and nobody knew what everybody else was doing. So they created, about 3 years ago, the legislature created an institution called the Interinstitutional Commission, and then they asked, and they simply created it by a law. To create it in fact, they asked myself and this other person to come down and recommend to them how it should be structured organizationally, how it should be managed, how it can be funded, how it would relate to the other governmental units which they would be in control of. They would manage everything that happens within the watershed. So that was the assignment. Frankly, it was very challenging, and I enjoyed it because it's so current. It's an event in history that is going to be significant, and what we did is a very, very small part of it, but it's exciting to have your oar in the water, so to speak.
Well, out of that whole process, you also have a report, I believe, that when you finished your work and all that they will be able to use.
Yes, a year ago, we were there for 2 months, and when we left them this report that's on the creation, implementation, management, and financing of this new commission, this new governmental body. Frankly, it's like creating the EPA. That would be the comparison. Really very interesting for me. But we recommended to them how they do all these things. This then was given to the Panama Canal Commission, who passed it on then to the president of the country, and then it was given to the legislature to take an action on. Now, with some changes, this plan was adopted. When I went back a month ago, it was to start the discussion on the actual implementation of this.
Thank you very much, Janelle Burke.
I want to get a few more facts about the Panama Canal and the area around it. About what kind of rainfall do they have a year?
Well, within the rainforest of the watershed itself, 3,000 to 5,000 inches of rainfall per year. It's a lot. It rains every day.
So that gives us some idea of the amount of water they're trying to catch.
Tremendous.
And about how many ships? You had indicated about 35 ships a day, or 37 ships a day?
The average today is 37.
And give us some idea of what the tolls might be so that we understand the significance of this to the economy.
I don't know the exact rate per ton, but the toll is based on a basic factor per ton of freight that goes through there, or the number of passengers aboard a ship. The largest toll paid by any single ship going through the canal was a Princess cruise liner that paid $141,000.
And how was that paid? All in...
It has to be paid. That's the law. You have to pay cash, or you may not go in the canal.
And there are some smaller fares, though, as well.
Well, yes, of course. It goes by the size of your vessel. And the smallest fare, you're remembering I told you this, that the smallest fare, the toll they collected was 29 cents to a man, Richard Halliburton, who swam the length of the Panama Canal, and they charged him because they had to open and close all the gates.
Do you have any idea about how long it takes a ship to go through the canal? And does that depend somewhat on what's happening as well?
No, the average time to transit the canal, once you enter a lock on the east end or the west end, is about 8 or 9 hours, sometimes only 7. But the ships that come there gather out in the ocean, they drop anchor, and they report in to some traffic manager. And if you have a real big ship, you'll go through the canal all by yourself. If I have a small one and Steve has a small one, they'll put us together, and so they group you. So from the time you drop anchor here and get organized and routed in and have your admission, 24 to 36 hours, but actually only 8 or 9 hours within the canal.
And it takes quite a bit of amount of water for each one of those ships that's in the canal.
Yes, it does. 52 million gallons of water per vessel.
Steve Sheen.
Frank, what's driving the urge to expand? Is there more ship traffic than the canal can handle?
I believe there is. I think they want to handle it more efficiently, and they then think that they will have more traffic. Because frankly, the wait for 24, 36 hours to make an 8-hour journey, I'm sure is costly to those shipping companies. Mm-hmm. And so if they can speed that up, they'll attract more traffic. That's the only incentive that I would know. They're doing a lot to speed it up.
Roughly the population of Panama is what?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say this expert does not know.
How about Panama City?
Panama City must be close to it's got to be over 500,000.
Okay. Let's talk about Panama City a little bit. I assume that's where you were based when you did your work
Yes,
in both
mm-hmm.
both occasions.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned a bit earlier in the show about the business acumen of the people, well-educated, motivated to do a good job. Your wife accompanied you on your first trip as a tourist. How did you feel about the area?
Well, we just felt like explorers. It was so attractive. There were places, just like any city that you go to, there's certain places you do not want to go, mm-hmm. and certainly you don't want to go at night. Mm-hmm. And that's the same like in many of our cities in the United States, but we were told where not to go. But where we could go is beautiful. You know, you see downtown part of Panama City is very modern architecture, but then if you get out into the edges of the city, then you see some of the old Spanish architecture and the influence of the early churches and so forth.
You mentioned that there are hundreds of different corporations that have their corporate headquarters in Panama City because of the favorable tax treatment they receive there. Does the city have a very international flavor as a result of that?
Yes, it does. It is. I was surprised to learn that business community is made up of a lot of people who are from Israel. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of Spanish influence there. I mean, businessmen, banks, industrial people, Spanish, some German, and what no one has mentioned yet tonight is there's a growing Chinese influence.
I see. And I'm going to close, if Tony will let me, with one last question about IESC. In my wife's case, every time she's been posted somewhere, and once was Armenia, once was in Cairo, Egypt, she was part of a small community of IESC volunteers. They, at least in her experience, they tend to group those volunteers together, and they weren't always Americans. Certainly, there is the comfort of sharing a living space with people who speak your language, mm-hmm. but the IESC volunteers were drawn from all over the world. Was that the case for you in Panama?
No, there was one other volunteer from IESC there, but he was working to help improve a railroad down there, and he was not where we could visit with him.
I see. Thank you.
Steve always indicates that I can't resist the political questions, and he knows that I will do that. It's been a long time since the treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate for this transition period and the actual turning over of the canal to the Panamanian government during the Carter administration. And as you've indicated, that time is now upon us. In fact, this show will be airing in December at the time that that is about to take place. And when President Bush was in office, there was obviously some great concern about Noriega and what was going on and the problems that existed. And I would assume that if he had stayed in power, that would have really affected this whole process. Share with us, as someone yourself who's involved in government, how are the people of Panama reacting to his being removed and what has happened as they're about to take over the canal as a government, an independent country?
It was obvious to us that they were very embarrassed about the Noriega history because it seemed almost as quickly as they could nicely do it, they would apologize for Noriega, and even taxi cab drivers would point out that was a Noriega hideout, and that's where U.S. Army captured Noriega. They were pleased that that problem had been solved.
in relation to that with the new government, share a little bit with us about how the government is doing under the present leadership.
Well, the present leadership was just put into position
Right.
because
Right.
there was an election a year ago, August, a constitutional election that determined whether or not the public would approve a president succeeding himself. And they said no very loudly, almost a 70% no, that they couldn't succeed himself. So they had to have a new presidential election. That occurred this last May. The person elected is a lady, and she just took office September 1st. And she's now in the process of making all the staff appointments, all of those political things that need to be done. And so there's turmoil down there right now. I wouldn't call it chaos, but there's just a lot of change at this time. The people I worked with, frankly, I have a lot of confidence in. They're all stable. And so I think management-wise, they'll survive the little political hiatus that's going on right now, and it'll be okay.
With the significant vote of the people and the election, the change of government, those kind of developments, does that make work easier for organizations like the International Executive Service Corps to go in? And is the government more eager to adopt such programs and policies that you worked on while you were there?
Frankly, it's a little inconvenient for us to get the program implemented because it could have been implemented a year ago, but because of these elections and these questions, decisions were not made. It was just they kept putting it off and putting it off. The law was in place, the program was in place, but the political will was not in place. It was just staff people worried about whether or not they'd be on the staff after the next election. And so with that uncertainty, people were not about to make significant decisions. So it has been an impediment. But now I can see that it's the reason they called me down again a month ago, was that it looks like now everything will start moving forward.
So I hear you saying, I think that now that the government's getting in place, that they are they more, I guess, focusing on the need for coordination and bringing all this together like this report indicates, rather than being so non-coordinated?
No, they are absolutely dedicated to this program of environmental control of the watershed. And there are groups that want it just for the environmental values that happen. Other people want it for the economic benefits that will occur.
Which is very major, isn't it?
It
Their
is.
economic life depends on
Yes,
that.
it is. And so the two of there are no opponents to it. Everybody knows it needs to be done.
It's one of those situations that you find occasionally where different forces and groups have a win-win for everyone.
Yes, this one's going to be that.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Well, your work was very important, but I know that a good number of our viewers also travel a lot, and you've indicated that it would be a very nice place to visit. And I want to follow up a little bit on your discussion with Steve earlier. What are some of the other places that you would suggest that people might want to go if they're visiting Panama? Up into the hills, perhaps?
That's exactly what my answer was going to be. A year ago when we were there for 2 months, we were so busy we didn't have time, but we did take 3 days out of 1 week and traveled up north towards Costa Rica, up into the hills where the coffee plantations are. It is absolutely beautiful country. You get back in the farms and you see a horse with a saddle on it. The horse is just tied to a fence, standing under a tree. And it's just old-time images that you can imagine for that part of the world. It is just great. And what we really enjoyed, the people, they're friendly and they're sensitive to your needs. We very seldom met anyone who could not speak English.
I was just going to ask about language. I take it that the language of the country, however, is probably Spanish.
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm.
But most people have a familiarity with English so that you can converse with them.
And there's an interesting reason why they all spoke English, was because if you wanted to work for the Panama Canal while the U.S. managed it, you had to be fluent in English. So they all studied English when they were in school there.
And there are some resorts as well, I understand, perhaps off on the islands off Panama.
Oh, for resorts off of Panama within a 45-minute flight, there's islands offshore in the Caribbean side and the Pacific side. They're just marvelous places and much less expensive than the usual cost that you would see for facilities like that.
Do they have beaches and good water?
This big white beaches and clear water, and it's tropical. It's like Cancun and places in the Caribbean, just like that.
Steve Sheen,
Frank, you've made, let's see, we said 13 assignments. I'm not sure whether it was before the show or during the show that you said that's 16 trips, though, because sometimes you've gone back on the same assignment. What keeps you going back with IESC?
It's first of all, we always like the challenge. You know, we just like to come up against a problem that challenges your experience and your thinking. And the other thing I think is that the work is always appreciated strongly by the people who are there trying to serve. They appreciate it greatly. And when it's all done, you feel that if they implement just some of it, you will have made a help. You would have been of assistance to those people.
You've been in the private sector and obviously involved in government. And there's a lot of cynicism, I think, in America toward programs that are government-sponsored. Is this one that works in your estimation?
Well, my estimation is it truly works. I wish I had the economic numbers to cite, but where IESC has sent volunteers like your wife on business assignments, and they study over a period of years subsequent to that the amount of business that we do there, the amount of export business that we do in those countries increases strongly, and you can track it exactly. Isn't that IESC created the business? Is that IESC introduced the U.S. into the economies of those countries.
They help build the relationships. That's an interesting point, and I don't think we've talked about it before. I'm tiptoeing close to Tony's subject matter here, but it seems to me that the other thing that it does is build understanding between cultures. Gretchen was always very much impressed at how grateful people were for the assistance that they were given and how much they soaked up anything she was willing to share with them. Your experience also?
Same thing. It scares you because they're believing everything you say, and you think, my goodness, I better be right. I better not give them bad advice.
It makes you work hard, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It really does.
Thank you.
We're almost out of time, but you also, the different assignments you've had, some are, there's more cultural differences than there are others. There are less familiarity. Is that not true? With so I would suppose that some are much more challenging.
There was no cultural challenge. This one, the people know it. Matter of fact, all these people, I believe, were educated in the United States.
That makes it a long difference.
University of Texas and Arizona.
On that note, I have to bring the program to conclusion. I'm sorry we're out of time. Frank Henderson, thank you for your outstanding comments on the program, and the panel joins me in expressing our appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Frank Henderson, who has been with the International Executive Service Corps in his most recent assignment to Panama. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at the same time when we shall move to yet another issue. Until then, please have a very good week.
North Idaho College Public Forum is the longest-running public television show of its type in North America and is seen in 7 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational community outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another new edition of North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.